Well, you are learning more about the 18th dynasty than probably you ever wanted to know, but that's the way it is. So, we are in Exodus. We're picking up at verse 11 of chapter 2. And so if you'd like to find your way there. One of the nice things about using the Pew Bible for me is then I can just grab one of the Bibles at church and bring it in. But the bad thing is I always forget to do that. So then I have to go running into the sanctuary and grab a Bible. So I got to put that on my checklist of things to remember.
See, I have one from the library.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Thank you. I'll remember that for future reference. We have noticed that in the time frames of Exodus so far, we've had three kind of moments. I'm assuming, and of course I want to keep telling you that in some ways these are working assumptions, they are hypotheses. No one has established this to the satisfaction of everybody, and most of these positions are minority positions, but I'm taking the one that is the most appealing to me, that this all happened in the 18th dynasty. That certainly squares with the biblical chronology. And that the Pharaoh who is said to have arisen in Egypt that didn't know Joseph would be Amos, the founder of the 18th dynasty. Probably somewhere in the middle of his reign, he adopted this policy of reducing God's people to slave status. And he did that for fear of a return visit from the Hyksos, who were also Semites, and he was afraid of this enemy within, as it were, joining them and creating problems. That's at least a plausible explanation of what happened. So that's the first little time frame we've looked at in Exodus. The second one seems to come later, under the reign of this second king, Amenhotep I. He reigns for 22 years, and he seems to ratchet up the pressure, and he's the one apparently who put in place the policy of infanticide that was supposed to be implemented by the midwives there, and we looked at that a couple of weeks ago as well. And that obviously didn't work either. It just seems that the people of God kept increasing and growing and multiplying and so on. And then apparently toward the end of his reign, he pushes the pressure even further and puts in place this ghastly rule that these children should simply be tossed into the... honey, I'm now remembering to turn on this one. It's nice to go through life sort of mentally impaired, because then you just have all of these wonderful epiphanies that happen to you all the time. It's kind of the way I feel about most things in life. Just, oh, what a surprise. But in any event, that seems to be the policy that Amenhotep put into place right toward the end of his reign, which is, his reign ends in 1524. That's a widely accepted date. All of these are pretty widely accepted among Egyptologists. These aren't private opinions. These are more or less conventional dates that would be generally accepted among Egyptology studies. We know from a biblical chronology that Moses was born right about then, you see. If he was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus in 1447, then that would mean his birth was 1527, which would be within just a couple of years. Usually we can assume there are some rounding of numbers, so it would put it right at that period of time. It's, of course, that incident, the birth of Moses, that gives rise to the subject of the topic we looked at last week of the discovery of Moses there in the Nile by Hatshepsut, if that was indeed who it was, the daughter of Pharaoh, as she's called. She's not the daughter of Amenhotep. She's the daughter of Thutmose. What had happened was Thutmose was a military character who married into the family because Amenhotep had no sons, but he did have a daughter. And so Thutmose married the daughter some years earlier. And by the time that the regime change takes place, Hatshepsut would be a teenager. And she fits the parameters the best. And there is I will say, at least modestly widely accepted hypothesis that she is this daughter of Pharaoh that discovered Moses. This is not proven. We've never dug up a hieroglyphic, showing Hatshepsut pulling this baby out of the drink. But at least in terms of the time frames and the story that's told, there is a kind of appeal to this theory. And this is not my private, invention here, but this has been at least to some degree accepted. So, if that's the case, then probably sometime around the regime change when Thutmose takes the throne, you have this beginning of the story of Moses. He's reared for the first 2 or 3 years by his mother, as you know from last week, and then adopted into the royal family there in Egypt. As the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he would become part of the royal family and would have status therein. So that's where we left it. What we find as we read the text is that we have little moments where time is skipped, and we see that again. We have about a 40-year skip in time now. So we're going to pick up at verse 11 of chapter 2. We'll just read the first short paragraph and then try to fill in again what's happening here to make some sense out of what the text is saying. So we're at chapter 2, verse 11, book of Exodus, the Word of God. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw 2 Hebrews fighting. And he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely this thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. And we'll stop right there for the moment and just consider that paragraph. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Great God, we are deeply grateful to you for the privilege that it is to gather here. We thank you for this place of worship. We thank you for your people. We thank you that as we come together in your name, you have guaranteed your presence among us. We pray that our consideration this morning of these great events that took place so long ago would nevertheless be by your Holy Spirit brought right up to date for us, and that you would apply these things to our hearts in such a way that our minds and lives and vision would be lifted to the Lord Jesus Christ, to whom all glory is due. We give you thanks for it in his name. Amen. All right, well, you noticed there's about 40 years between verse 10 and verse 11. Catch that? So we left Moses drawn out of the water, adopted into the family, and now we hear in verse 11, one day after Moses had grown up. The purpose, of course, of the Old Testament is not to give us a chronology of ancient Egypt, but it does help to have some idea what was going on. And so I want to take a few minutes, if you'll bear with me, to try to fill in what happened between the birth of Moses way back here and this moment some 40 years later, when now we find Moses going out and visiting his people and trying to find out something of their condition. It's a little bit complicated. I'm just going to tell you that up front, but if you work with me here, do not let your eyes glaze over. I am watching. All right. Thutmose is the father of Hatshepsut. Thutmose II is the brother of Hatshepsut. Thutmose III is the stepson of Hatshepsut. So we got 3 Thutmoses. And they have that relationship to Hatshepsut. Father, brother / husband, and then stepson. All right. So the story begins with the father, Thutmose I. He's fairly old by the time he takes the throne. As I say, he has a teenage daughter. He has a a son by a minor wife, and that fact in itself made the claim of that son to the throne somewhat doubtful. To the Egyptians, it was very important how you were born to establish your claim to be the successor. And so Hatshepsut, being a female, wasn't in a good position. This son, Thutmose II, wasn't in a good position because he was born of a rather minor, more of a concubine. And so Thutmose I did something fairly common in Egyptian, political protocol. He had the two marry. So Hatshepsut marries her half-brother, Thutmose II. We, of course, find that a little bit offensive in modern thought, but at the time that was quite common. And so now Hatshepsut, who is arguably the adoptive mother of Moses, is in a position of co-ruling in Egypt with her half-brother, Thutmose II. That reign goes on for about 14 years. This guy was never in very good health. And he died in 1504, leaving Hatshepsut alone. However, he had a son by a concubine. Same problem. But it was the only possibility of a successor. And so Hatshepsut is installed as the regent ruler, one of the few female rulers in Egypt, waiting for Thutmose III, her stepson, to come of age. Well, Hatshepsut was a very smart lady, and she was very ambitious, and she wanted to rule Egypt in her own right. And she didn't like her stepson, nor did he like her. And so, using this brief period of time, Thutmose III is technically reigning, but during this period, Hatshepsut is really running things. She moves him off to the fringes. She moves him out to become a kind of water boy in the military. Hatshepsut does not like the military. She is a pacifist. As the old saying goes, she would rather trade than raid. You've heard that old saying, haven't you? And so she wants to get this little fly in the ointment out of the way, and she figures the best place for him to lose himself is with those military, and she doesn't like them either. That's probably the single biggest tactical blunder of her entire career. She underestimated the importance of the military, and she underestimated the potential for this Thutmose III to become a popular kind of figure in the Egyptian military. But for a while, he's just a kid. It's a problem that she has solved. All right. So in 1498, Hatshepsut declares she is the pharaoh, repudiating the rule of Thutmose. She kind of violates the rules there. She was supposed to be a regent, but now she simply declares, I'm it. She wears the false beard as a female to give that commanding authority. And the hieroglyphs of Hatshepsut that you can see to this day will show her with this very feminine face and the false beard, you see. How old is Moses about this time? If he's born in 1427, right here, at the point that Hatshepsut claims the throne, he's about 30 years old. He has been trained in the most wonderful and sophisticated education known to the ancient world. This is going to be a practical training in statecraft. The likelihood is, or at least there's certainly an argument to be made, that Hatshepsut, who had no son except Moses, if this is the correct connection, was actually grooming Moses to be her successor. And of course, if that's the case, and nobody's ever proven that, I'm just saying that's a hypothesis that is certainly appealing. If that's the case, then it would mean that Moses was given the very finest of every educational advantage, which does help explain how this man could be such a powerful ruler later and become the great lawgiver to the Israelites as he leads them off, after the Exodus into the wilderness. But for right now, that's what goes on. So, Hatshepsut rules. She rules for 15 years. During this time, she's quite successful. Egypt does well. There is considerable wealth that comes in. She's a good negotiator, a good trader, and so on. But all the while, under the radar, this young man is rallying support. So that toward the end of her reign, all of a sudden she becomes aware of her worst nightmare, that the military is rallying to Thutmose III and against her, and it puts her in a very awkward, difficult position. And she becomes embattled, and in the last couple of years of her reign, she's facing horrific pressure from a hostile military led by a very popular claimant to the throne, Thutmose III, that she thought she had gotten rid of, you see. And so all of a sudden, things are looking ugly. Moses, if he was there, and was indeed in that court at that time, would be caught in the crossfire. He was as unpopular in the mind of Thutmose as would be Hatshepsut, you see. And so that may account for the fact that when Moses was about 40 years old, he begins to think about his own people. Now, if you don't mind me, as long as I'm out here speculating like mad, I'll just speculate a little more. I think that maybe Moses, who's a very bright guy, was expecting that he might be the successor to Hatshepsut, and I think probably he was envisioning that if he were installed into that position, the first legislative act he would, implement would be to relieve the burden on this people. He knew he was Hebrew. He had been with his mother long enough. I don't think there's any question. He knew his own origins. He knew that that was his background. And he was concerned about it. And I think probably in his understanding at that time, he actually saw himself as someone who God in his providence had brought into this remarkably strategic role just so that he could be the one who by a sort of legislative fiat could relieve the burden on God's people and reinstate them to their proper status there in the Egyptian economy. I think that's probably what Moses had in mind. He never read the book of Esther, because Esther hadn't happened yet, but he probably was thinking, maybe you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. The lesson we need to learn from this, friends, is we can always assume that God's providence is at work. We can never assume that we've quite read it right. We can always trust that God knows what he's doing and that God is causing things to work together for good. We can never be so arrogant as to think we see it. That's it. Because God is always working with ways that are higher than our ways. And believe me, in the case of Moses, he couldn't have been more stunned at the way these things played out. Exactly the opposite of what he was expecting. So, all of a sudden, he sees his adoptive mother besieged. He sees the forces turning against her. And in fact, Hatshepsut she dies under very unusual circumstances. Many scholars believe that she was assassinated, maybe poisoned. It wasn't a violent death. But she dies a little prematurely there in 1483. But she dies under circumstances that the military pressure is irresistible. And so Moses, rather, if he was there, rather than making a claim to the throne, which created a possible civil war he could never have won, he turns his attention to his people. He goes out among them. This for him probably feels like plan B. Plan A just blew up in his face. His adoptive mother is dead. His, stepbrother, who hates his guts, is now on the trail. And so Moses goes out to visit his people, probably realizing his days in the court are over, or at least numbered. So one day, in this time frame, we know from other texts that he was about 40 years old, so it would have to be in this time frame. When Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their force later. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. The Hebrew word that's used for beating there is a word that implies a death blow. It's a very strong word. So it's not just a beating such as you might find in a slave culture generally, but this person is being treated to an abusive strike here that might actually kill him, and maybe did. Moses looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Part of the training that Moses had received and would have received as an heir to the throne would be a little training in martial arts, you know. I think there was a little Jack Bauer factor going on here, if you're familiar with that name. I think sometimes you get the feeling that the wheels of justice grind a little too slowly. And Moses, who had seen it firsthand, he'd seen this abuse, he'd seen this possible murder, felt that he wasn't going to, file a suit in the criminal court and see if anything would happen, and so he just takes matters into his own hands. The man has a finely honed sense of justice, and at this point he's not willing to go by ordinary channels, so he takes this character out. He killed the Egyptian, hid him in the sand. I heard one commentator say once, you can try to hide bodies in the sand, but inevitably you'll see some toes sticking out, And so I think that must have been what happened. I think Moses thought he'd gotten away with it. I think he thought he'd been able to cover his tracks, but there must have been some toes sticking out of the sand. So, when he went out the next day, verse 13, he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, why do you strike, and that's again a very strong word, strike with what could be a fatal blow, your fellow Hebrew? So Moses seemed to go out with the idea in his mind of inserting himself into a leadership role. That's presumably what he intends to do. The New Testament confirms that that's what Moses had in mind. That he expects to be recognized by his people as one who has been particularly situated to be their leader and to do some good thing for them. He has this remarkable background in the Egyptian court. He has the training, he has the inside knowledge of the ways of Egyptian politics, and even if he's not going to be the heir to the throne, he at least expects that he can act as a powerful advocate on behalf of these Jewish slaves and win their freedom, or at least win some kind of great relief from the burdens that they're experiencing. So he's going out with that in his mind, and now, for the second time, he finds himself caught in these just little altercations that are going on, and this one now between two Hebrews. So he asks the question, why are you striking your fellow Hebrew? And the answer that's given is extremely important. It's really critical to the whole text. He answered, that is, the Hebrew answered, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Now, what's interesting about that text is, as you may recall, when Stephen, the first Christian martyr, is preaching before the Sanhedrin, he's going through various strategic moments in the history of Israel, drawing parallels between those Old Testament events and the experience of Christ. And one of the first stories he tells is the story of Moses, and he tells this very story in some detail. And he quotes this verse. And of course, what Stephen is driving at as he makes this argument to the Jewish Sanhedrin is that these things that have happened in the Old Testament represent a kind of paradigm, sort of typical reaction of God's people to those whom God sends as their liberator saviors, culminating, of course, in Christ himself. And so the parallel is clear enough. Here you've got Moses. Moses is trained in Egypt. He's living in the glory of the palace. He has all of these wonderful advantages. He's been peculiarly, it seems, equipped by God. to be a liberator for the people of God. And yet when Moses actually goes out and confronts them directly, the rebuff he hears is, hey, who made you a king over us? Who do you think you are? Moses came unto his own, and his own received him not. See that? Stephen, telling the same story, tells two or three others that have a similar kind of design to them, and finally says this is what the Jewish people of his day had done with Christ. Christ, like Moses, only in a grander scale, had come from a place of glory, place of incredible prestige, unspeakable privilege, and condescended to come to his people as a liberator. And what did they say to them? Who made you a king over us? Jesus himself tells the story, you may recall, from if you were here last year in our studies of Luke, of a king who goes off to receive a kingdom, and an embassy goes after him to say, we do not want this man to rule over us. That was the response that Jesus got. And that was the response that Moses got. And there's a sense in which you see that motif again and again down through the scriptures. I think the text is telling me to ask us all, where is it in each of our lives that we say, who made you a king over me? You know, we're all here, presumably because we have Christian faith. The New Testament stipulates that the formula for salvation is to confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord. Not just buddy, friend, companion, Lord. And to the ancient world that meant absolute sovereign. And confess with your mouth God raised him from the dead. To embrace the fundamental content of the gospel, and to confess, meaning to say with conviction and sincerity, I will have this man to reign over me. But if you're anything like me, there's always those little parts of your life that you're holding out, Except this little closet, that little dark corner, this little habit, that little whatever. You have to explore your own conscience here to find the answers, but isn't it very much part of our experience that we want to, Jesus, you're my Lord, and yet we have these little hole cards that we're sort of keeping back and saying, well, except for that. And the terms of the Christian confession are that Jesus is Lord, and nothing less than that will do. The question here, of course, was who made you Lord over us? This guy asked Moses that question. All right, well, Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. That would obviously not be Hatshepsut. That would be the successor, the stepbrother of Moses, who would be looking for an excuse. He wouldn't have any legitimate reason to just take Moses out, but now he's got a good excuse. Moses can be tried and convicted as a murderer, removed as any kind of competitive claimant to the throne, and Moses realizes that all of a sudden, all of his grand designs have apparently just collapsed into a heap of ashes. And he probably, how many times do you suppose he was kicking himself? How much recrimination do you think he was going through here as he saw all of the privilege just going up in smoke? Lost. I mean, has it ever happened? Have you ever thought to yourself, I know this is Sunday school, I shouldn't use language quite this colorful, but so bear with me. Have you ever said to yourself, what a screw up? Look at what I had and look at what I did. And you just look back and you think, what a loser. Have you ever? Am I the only one? I don't know. Can you imagine the self-talk that was going through Moses' mind? He'd had 2 big bites at the apple, and both of them, gone. Maybe he blamed himself even for what had happened to his adoptive mother Hatshepsut. Maybe he felt like if he had somehow intervened, stepped in, been watching more, she would still be alive. Who knows what he was thinking? But at this point, I can't imagine that he was feeling anything other than that he had just blown it so big time that his name would probably become synonymous with the biggest failures in the history of the world. I think probably that's kind of what he was thinking at this point. Well, so Moses fled from Pharaoh. Now it is interesting, if you read the brief account of Moses in Hebrews chapter 11. You know, Hebrews chapter 11 is so-called Hall of Fame of Faith. You're familiar with that? And all of the great heroes of faith in the Old Testament are trotted out before us, and their great exploits of faith are sort of set before us as great examples. And Moses, in the comment that's made on him, says this: Moses, in faith, not fearing the wrath of Pharaoh, fled. And I know I've read that 100 times, and it just kind of, every time, something about that doesn't quite add up, does it? Moses, in faith, not fearing Pharaoh, fled. Whoa! A little oxymoronic there. But the commentators help me on this. I think the best view of it is Moses was not fleeing at this point. If the writer to the Hebrews is correct, and I'm going to assume he is, Moses is not fleeing at this point out of simple, abject, self-interested fear of the consequences of his act. He is fearing for his people. He is fearing that this sort of, bad set of incidents that have occurred are actually going to make things worse for the people of Israel. He's going to become, in a sense, the pivot point that legitimizes treating them even more poorly. And in a sense, to help them avoid that, he wants to get himself out of the situation. Now, that's speculation, but to me, it at least kind of makes sense and may make sense out of that text in Hebrews. But be that as it may, Moses fled from Pharaoh, and let's take the next paragraph. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you come back so soon today?" They said, "This Egyptian dude." Well, that is in the Hebrew, It's, of course, I don't read Hebrew, so that's... This Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. He said to his daughters, "Well, where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread." And Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I've been an alien residing in a foreign land." Another famous incident, of course, the flannel graphs are in your mind, aren't they, here for all of this. So Moses settled in the land of Midian. I mentioned this last week. I'll just remind you that Moses is somewhere in what's called Lower Egypt, that is northern Egypt. And when he flees, he's going to be fleeing westward, and he would escape along the standard trade route across the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula. He'd have no reason to go south. There were a lot of Egyptian forces present doing mining operations in the south of the Sinai, and he's wanting to avoid them. And this was a very widely used trade route, and so he probably, it's shown possible exit route, but it's also the route that Moses took. And he probably came right down here, right at the northern tip of what's called the Gulf of Aqaba, into this called Midian. Midian is today part of what we call Saudi Arabia. This is safe haven for him. He's outside the jurisdiction of the Egyptians. Egyptian jurisdiction reached through the Sinai Peninsula, but did not reach west of the Gulf of Aqaba line there, and so he would be at a safe place. And that's where he is. Midian, by the way, of course, you may know, plays somewhat prominently in the Old Testament. You'll hear of the Midianites, who will occasionally attack Israel. Israel's just straight to the north, and so it was a pretty straight shot, and that was part of what continued to distinguish them in Old Testament history. But for now, of course, this is a safe haven for Moses. He settled in the land of Midian. The word settled is important. This all didn't happen just in an afternoon. Moses didn't show up out of breath from, running across the Sinai, sit down by the well, and all this stuff happened. He was there for a while. The word settled implies that he found a place to live. He settled in. He was there at least a few weeks, maybe even a couple of months or more. And so he's settled. He's there. He's probably observing. He's a smart guy. He does, he's thinking to himself, I'm not going to mess up again. Well, he's kind of watching what's going on and thinking probably somewhat tactically here. Then he went and sat down by the well. That would be the common behavior of someone who was offering his services as a day laborer. The well, and by the way, the definite article is used there, so it says he sat down by the well, meaning it was the center of the community, and it was a place where people would come and basically make themselves available to work for the day and be paid at the end of the day, and apparently that's how Moses was getting along during this period of time, however long it was. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. We don't know what sort of priest he was. It's a very interesting, intriguing question as you survey the Old Testament, especially the earlier parts of the Old Testament. What allowance does God make for priestly activity outside the community of faith? But you do see hints of it. In other words, some commentators would argue, and I'm rather inclined to think this is accurate, that even though he's not a priest acting within the context of the covenant community of Israel, there is nevertheless a legitimacy to his priesthood. The most, of course, important or well-known example of that would be the character known as Melchizedek, who was said to be the priest of the Most High God. And yet we know nothing about him, but the Old Testament affirms that he was a true and legitimate priest way back there in the days of Abraham. And you have hints of that, and this one, the way it's framed suggests that even though Reuel was not a priest in the conventional parameters of worship in the Old Testament, this may nevertheless have been some kind of legitimate priesthood. I'm not going to die on that mountain, and if you think, I'm missing that, then fine, more power to you. I'm just saying I think there's a little hint of that here, for whatever it may be worth. He had 7 daughters. They came, this was obviously a daily routine, to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. This was absolutely typical in the ancient world for women to get water from the well. You hear frequently all the way through the Bible of women getting water from the well. Even the woman at the well story in the New Testament is, kind of matches that idea. There was men's work, there was women's work. I hate to, put it that way, but that's the way it was in the ancient world, and drawing water from the well was viewed as women's work. Of course, the problem was that these women had no good defense against these thugs who came and took the water. That's what happened. So they drew the water. They were used to it. It happened every day. They drew the water to water the flocks of their own father. Then these guys are standing around having a smoke, and as soon as they're done, they come up, they push the girls away, and they use that water that they have just drawn to water their own flocks. Thanks a lot! And off they go, and then the women have to go and pull this more water out. And you can just imagine, every day, this is the way it is. So, here they are, they drew the water, filled the troughs. Some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses has been watching this. Now, note to self, Moses says, don't kill them. I'm sure he could have. I think Moses probably had a pretty impressive bearing. He was a pretty impressive guy, I imagine, at this point. He's about 40 years old. He's at the very prime of his health and life, and I have a feeling that one Moses versus maybe a dozen or so of these rude rural shepherds, it was not even an even match, and they were not about to take this guy on. He just gave that impression. So he chases them off. And of course, Moses isn't dumb. He's kind of playing this situation a little bit, if you don't mind me just speculating. So he then draws the water. He wants work. And this is a great way to sort of ingratiate himself. He's been watching the situation. So he draws the water and waters their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "Whoa, how is it that you've come back so soon today?" Obviously, the routine was pretty much in place. And so he's wondering how that happened. And they give him this explanation. There was this Egyptian who helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. Now, Reuel sounds a little harsh here. He said to his daughters, "Well, where is he? What's the matter with you guys? Why'd you leave the man out there? Invite him to come in." And you kind of wonder about that, don't you? But we have to understand the rules of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. They were very rigid and very highly esteemed. Number one, it would be improper for these women to extend an invitation to Moses no matter what he did for them. That was reserved to the man of the house. So if they had invited him in, they would have broken a bigger rule yet. But my suspicion is that they said to Moses, "Hey, come along and wait outside." And I have a feeling Moses was about 15 feet away from the front door, just kind of, cooling his heels, wondering what might happen. The girls go in, giving absolute deference to their father, telling the story. Now the father is required by the same rules of ancient Near Eastern hospitality to be outraged that they didn't extend an invitation, but they better not have done so. You see, it's just that kind of thing. "Well, what's the matter with you girls? Why didn't you invite him in?" But don't you ever do that kind of deal, So these were tough rules to live by, but a lot of the humor in the Old Testament is understood if you really see how that works. So he goes out. Of course, he extends, as he has the right to do, the invitation, and Moses agreed to stay with the man, and over the process of time, of course, he is given this daughter, whose name is Zipporah, and they marry, and I think probably from this point of view, from this time on, from Moses' point of view, he figured this was it. This was probably better, he thought, than he deserved, but this was probably going to be the end of his career. And so he settles down with this woman, the daughter of the priest, and they have this first son. They actually have two sons. The second one is born a little later. And he gives him the name Gershom, and just a little tiny alteration of that is the Hebrew word for alien or refugee. And so he names him for what Moses perceives as his refugee status. Now let's just take these last few verses here, and we'll reach the end of this chapter. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Here, of course, now the author is connecting the events that have happened here with the great events of redemption in the book of Genesis, which he will do again and again. We come up for air, we get this theological perspective that's added now, a little commentary along the way. We've become so engrossed in the story, we might have forgotten this is part of a much grander and bigger scheme, of course. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. Well, the king of Egypt we're speaking of here would obviously be Thutmose. He did reign for a long time. Not only was this reign, the short reign up here, when he was a minor under the regency of his stepmother Hatshepsut, but then he comes back, of course, takes the throne in 1483 and rules then down to 1450 and dies in 1450. That's a very well-established date in Egyptian history, that Thutmose III died in 1450. The effect of his reign was remarkable. Thutmose is widely regarded as one of the most brilliant military strategists of all of Egyptian history. Again, if you don't mind me giving you a little map exercise here. At the time that Thutmose was reigning, the major power in the world were called the Mitanni. You may or may not have ever heard of them. They kind of came on the scene, were important for a while, passed from the scene, and so they never play directly into Old Testament history, so we don't typically hear of them. At the time, they were a fairly significant, threatening power. The Hittites were doing a little saber rattling over here. Thutmose III famously launched a military campaign up into Syria and really pushed back the Mitanni and pushed Egyptian borders way up. So Egypt actually controlled real estate going clear up, very north of Syria. It was probably the greatest expanse of control of land in the history of Egypt. It was under Thutmose III. He also pushed the borders down into what's called Nubia, and later called Ethiopia, to the south. So Thutmose is a remarkably powerful, competent, successful, effective military strategist. One of the greatest. You can read any book on Egyptian history, and you'll read that of Thutmose. He dies in 1450, having had an absolutely successful reign. The son that takes his place is called Amenhotep II. He is a young buck. He is full of himself. He's full of his father's bravado. He's an athlete. There's hieroglyphs of this guy riding on horseback, shooting arrows, hitting a target at a distance while moving along. You know, that kind of guy. He is athletic, and seems to have everything that his father had on steroids. It just looks like this guy is going to continue this. He is the perfect candidate to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He's a young man. He's full of his own ego, and it's only 3 years into his reign, 1447, that we have the events of the Exodus that take place. And if there was ever a candidate who looked like it was the right, description for the Pharaoh of the Exodus, it would be this character. So that story, of course, we'll pick up next week with the burning bush, and I think I'll stop there.